So, managing glycogen is pretty important for us in terms of our health and energy. Now, glycogen is created primarily by glucose or carbohydrates. The body can also use protein to make glycogen. But when you consume carbohydrates, they primarily get stored as glycogen in the liver, in the muscles, and a little bit of glucose gets converted into fat, but primarily fat gets converted into fat because it's more efficient that way for your body. Also, some fat in certain situations can be converted to glucose by the liver. Now, it's important to manage this glycogen because this tells us how much insulin is in the body and how much inflammation there is, and also how much energy you have for the day. So let's look at some situations here. Your liver and muscles can only store up so much. So if your liver and muscle stores of glycogen are low, that's where almost all the glucose is going to go, and it's going to require a certain amount of insulin. As the liver and muscles get more full of glycogen, a little bit more goes into the fat, but the body doesn't like to convert glucose into fat, so most of it's still going to go into the liver and muscles. But as they get filled up, the liver and muscles become more insulin resistant, so there's a little bit more insulin in the blood. And these proportions are not exact. This is just something to show you a demonstration of the fact that more insulin is required as you fill up these stores. Then what happens is once you completely fill them up, the only place left for the glucose to go is into fat cells or get converted to fat in the liver as well, and then the liver transports the fat to fat cells. And this requires much more insulin because insulin is more required to get into the fat cells because fat cells are naturally more insulin resistant. Now, if your liver and muscle cells are not full of glycogen, you have less insulin and less inflammation. But as they get more filled up, you get a little more insulin, but you're still not really having high insulin. So you get a little bit more fat storage, but this is still a decent situation. What happens is when you overeat to a point where your liver and muscle cells are overloaded, basically, you have higher elevated insulin, which leads to more inflammation. It leads to fattening. It can lead to thermogenesis. This just means that instead of glucose gets converted to fat, sometimes the body burns it off as heat because it doesn't like converting glucose into fat. It can also lead to a fatty liver, non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, because alcohol has to be converted into fat to be metabolized. The same thing is true of fructose, which is found in sweet sugars, but even just over-consuming regular starches like glucose carbohydrates can also lead to a fatty liver if it's over-consumed to a point where you can't store it in the liver anymore. In fact, a fatty liver can decrease the storage capacity of the liver, getting you to this situation where the glucose gets converted into fat sooner, and it can actually make the problem even worse. And this can also, the situation where the liver and muscles are full, can cause non-diabetic hypoglycemia, because what happens is you have higher insulin levels, and once the insulin is done storing the glucose as fat, there's a little bit of insulin left over, but there's a certain percentage left over, but since you have more insulin, that percentage means more insulin, and that can bring down the blood sugar, and that can cause mood problems and so forth. Now, there's certain ways of eating and certain foods you can eat and nutrients that help you store the glycogen better. Having enough potassium, for example, helps glycogen storage, but also just when and how you eat, even if you're eating the exact same food, can have an effect. So let's say we have two people, Tom and Jerry, and say they eat 2,500 calories a day, and they're getting fed the same exact food. So it's just a big bowl of gruel they're eating. Tom has a small breakfast, and Jerry has a large breakfast. Jerry doesn't need to snack until he eats lunch, and then he eats dinner without snacking as well. Now, because Tom had a small breakfast, he's going to have a snack before lunch. Then he's going to have a small lunch. But since he hasn't eaten so much, he's going to eat a large dinner and even a snack before bed. Now, let's see how this affects them differently. So at breakfast time, Tom's liver and Jerry's liver have been putting out glucose all night, but Jerry has a little more space in his liver because he didn't eat the snack. Also, he used his muscles a little bit after dinner without eating the snack, so he has a little more room for the extra calories that he's eating. But the calories that Tom does eat requires more insulin because his stores are more filled up, so he needs a little more insulin. Now, at lunchtime, Tom ate the snack after breakfast, but Jerry didn't. So Jerry's levels are a little lower, so he doesn't need quite as much insulin, but again, he's eating a little bit more calories. Now, at dinner time, this is where the bigger difference is because their stores are about the same because neither one of them had a snack. But Tom is going to be eating much more calories because he didn't eat as many calories earlier in the day. So this is going to require more insulin because he's going to get filled up and then still eat more calories. So he's going to be converting that to fat, whereas Jerry isn't because he's having a smaller dinner. And then Tom's going to have another snack on top of that because he ate so little at the beginning of the day. Again, Tom had a smaller breakfast and a smaller lunch with a snack, but Jerry over here ate most of his calories with breakfast and lunch and then just had a small dinner. So even if they're eating the same thing, Tom is on average going to need more insulin, and that is going to have him store more fat. Also, Tom is not going to have as steady of blood sugars if he needs more insulin. And this doesn't take into account the fact of exercise because neither one of them are exercising. So primarily they're going to be working with their liver stores, which is going to eventually be a problem for Tom because if he's converting fat in his liver, he can end up getting a more fatty liver, which actually decreases the storage capacity in his liver and makes this problem even worse. So it can be more important to eat a bigger breakfast. And breakfast basically just means when you break the fast, so it can actually be better to have a large breakfast later in the day. So it's better to actually skip breakfast than have a small breakfast. Now, something I wanted to note about glycogen in the liver versus the muscles is that glycogen in the muscles is to be used by the muscles. The glycogen in the muscles doesn't get broken apart and get released into the blood. That's more what the liver does. So the liver controls the blood sugar by releasing by breaking apart the glycogen and releasing that into the blood to increase the blood sugar if it needs to be increased. And also, if there's no glycogen available, fat can be transported to the liver and the liver can convert that into glucose.